The wheat was the color of a dead man's hair, and it moved in the wind like something breathing. Dylan Reeves stood at the edge of his rooftop garden with a Canon R5 on a tripod and a chef's knife in his back pocket, and he watched the combine harvester crawl across Harold Knox's south field like some prehistoric beetle feeding on the earth itself. Mid-June in Ohio, and the air tasted like dust and cut grain and the particular sweetness of a world that did not yet know it was ending. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and checked the monitor. The shot was good. Golden hour light spilling across the raised beds of tomatoes and basil and the heritage carrots he'd planted in April. And behind him the two-story farmhouse sat solid and white against the sky, and the solar panels on the south-facing roof threw back the sun like mirrors laid out for some pagan ceremony. "All right, guys," he said to the camera. "Day 214 of the homestead. We're pulling the first of the Danvers carrots today, and I'm thinking a roasted carrot soup with that sourdough we baked on Tuesday. Farm to table in about 90 minutes. Let's see what we got." He pulled a carrot from the soil and held it up. It was fat and orange and perfect, and he could already see the thumbnail, could already see the comments rolling in, the subscribers clicking. 1.2 million of them now, and the algorithm loved him because he was the real deal. Not some trust fund kid playing farmer. He'd done his time in the kitchens. He'd 12 years on the line, 2 years under Jean-Luc Moreau at Étoile in Chicago, where he'd learned to break down a whole lamb in under 4 minutes and plate a tasting menu for 60 without breaking a sweat. The Michelin star had been Moreau's, but the hands had been Dylan's, and everybody in that kitchen knew it. He'd traded all of it for 40 acres in rural Ohio and a YouTube channel, and he had not looked back. Not once. The homestead was everything he'd built it to be. Solar array, deep well with a hand pump backup, root cellar packed with canned goods and vacuum-sealed proteins, chicken coop, greenhouse, the kind of setup that made preppers weep with envy, and he'd documented every square foot of it for the camera. The radio on the potting bench crackled, something about a variant strain overseas, and he'd been half hearing these reports for a week now. Some kind of aggressive flu burning through coastal cities in Japan and South Korea. The talking heads couldn't agree on whether it was airborne or bloodborne or just the usual media hysteria that sold ad space. He turned the volume down and kept filming. From somewhere beyond the wheat field there came a sound, high and thin and wrong, like a dog being stepped on, except it wasn't a dog and it didn't stop. Dylan lowered the camera and listened. The combine had gone silent. The sound came again, and this time it was clearly human and clearly terror, and it cut through the summer air like a blade drawn across glass. His phone buzzed. A message from Patricia, his cousin in Tokyo. She was a correspondent for Reuters, and she did not scare easily. The message was a video on 32 seconds. He watched it standing there in his garden with the carrots at his feet and the evening light going gold to copper around him. A woman in a business suit on a street in Shibuya. She was on her knees over another woman, and she was biting. Not fighting, biting. Tearing with her teeth at the other woman's throat, and the blood was very bright on the white blouse, and the woman doing the biting had eyes that were wrong. Not vacant, not crazed, just white. Like the iris and pupil had been erased and replaced with milk. Patricia's text beneath the video read, "This is real. Get ready." Dylan laughed. He actually laughed, and stood there in his beautiful garden on his beautiful homestead and laughed the way a man laughs when the universe presents him with something so absurd that the only honest response is to reject it entirely. Then he watched the video again, and a third time, and the laugh dried up in his throat like water on a hot skillet. He went inside and found Mia at the kitchen table with her laptop and her spreadsheets. She was tracking their quarterly expenses against the channel revenue, and she had that look she always got when the numbers weren't cooperating. The look of a woman who had spent 8 years at Deloitte making corporations money make sense, and who now applied that same terrifying precision to counting jars of pickled beets. "We need to talk," he said. "The carrots?" "Not the carrots." He showed her the video, and she watched it once with no expression, and then she closed her laptop and looked at him and said, "How much rice do we have?" That was Mia. No panic. No questions about whether it was real or fake or what it meant for the broader geopolitical landscape. Just inventory. Just numbers. He loved her for it, and sometimes it scared him, and right now it was exactly what he needed. 200 pounds, maybe 220. Flour? 60 pounds, plus whatever Harold's got at the mill. Ammunition? He paused. Not enough. Joy came down the stairs in her pajamas with a book about butterflies pressed to her chest. 8 years old and quiet in the way that some children are quiet. Not shy, observant. She looked at her parents and she looked at the phone in her father's hand and she said, "What's wrong with that lady's eyes?" Dylan put the phone away. "Nothing, baby, go back up." "They looked like eggs," Joy said. She said it the way she said everything, like a fact, like an observation filed away for later use. Then she went back upstairs and Dylan listened to her footsteps on the old oak treads, and he thought about how those footsteps were the most important sound in the world and how he would do whatever was necessary to keep hearing them. He spent the next hour on the internet. The domestic live streams were worse than Patricia's video. Cleveland, Detroit, Pittsburgh. Shaky phone footage of people running and people falling and people who had stopped being people doing things to other people that Dylan's brain kept trying to categorize as special effects. And the comment sections were a mix of prayer and profanity and conspiracy theories, and he scrolled through them with the same clinical detachment he'd once used to read Yelp reviews of restaurants where he'd worked. He called the neighbors. Most didn't answer. Old Mrs. Bellamy down Route 7 said she'd heard something about a quarantine in Columbus, but her TV wasn't working right. The Hendersons weren't picking up. Harold Knox's line went to voicemail, and in the background of the recorded greeting you could hear the combine running and the wheat falling and the world still turning the way it always had. He was standing at the kitchen window when he saw it. Out past the fence line where the wheat started. A figure. Standing still at first and then moving, jerking, and like a marionette being worked by someone who'd never seen a human being walk before. It was Dave Pellegrino from 2 farms over, and Dave was a big man, 6'3" and 240, and he'd played offensive line at Ohio State back in the day. Now Dave was lurching through the wheat with his arms at wrong angles and his head cocked sideways, and even from 100 yards Dylan could see that Dave's shirt was dark with something that wasn't sweat. Dave reached the edge of Harold's field where 2 farmhands were loading equipment onto a flatbed. Dave hit the first one at a dead run and took him to the ground, and the sound that came across the field was not a sound that belonged in the world Dylan had woken up in that morning. Dylan locked the front gate. He locked the back gate. He pulled the emergency shutters on the ground floor windows, and he went to the gun safe in the basement, and he took out the Mossberg 500 and the Ruger 1022, and he loaded them both, and he set them on the kitchen table next to Mia's spreadsheets, and he looked at his wife and said, "We're not leaving this house." Mia nodded. She opened a new spreadsheet. She titled it, Inventory. Outside, the screaming had stopped. That was worse. Part 1. First bites. The morning came gray and wrong. No combine noise, no birdsong, just the wind moving through the wheat in a silence so total it felt like pressure against the eardrums. Dylan hadn't slept. He'd sat at the kitchen window with the Mossberg across his knees and watched the darkness and listened to the radio until the local station went to static at 3 a.m. And then he'd listened to the static because even that was better than the quiet. Mia slept for 2 hours in the chair beside him with her head on her arms at the table. Joy slept upstairs. He checked on her twice. Both times she was on her side with the butterfly book open on her pillow and her breathing slow and steady. and he stood in her doorway and felt something in his chest that was too big for his ribs to hold. At first light, he went to the rooftop garden and glassed the area with the binoculars. The wheat fields stretched flat and golden in every direction, and they looked the same as they always did, except for the dark shapes scattered through them. Some were lying down, some were standing. The standing ones weren't moving, they were just there, planted in the grain like scarecrows put up by a farmer with a sick sense of humor. Harold Knox's mill was visible a quarter-mile east, the big stone building with the wooden water wheel that hadn't turned in 20 years, but that Harold kept maintained because he was that kind of man, the kind who believed in preserving things. The door was open, and from this distance Dylan could see something dark smeared on the threshold. "We need flour," Mia said behind him. She'd come up without him hearing. She did that. And yeast, and whatever medical supplies Harold kept. "You see what's out there?" "I see approximately 11 stationary figures in the visible field, none between here and the mill. The path along the irrigation ditch provides cover for most of the route." He looked at her. She'd already mapped it. He'd already run the numbers. He wanted to tell her that this wasn't a spreadsheet, and that the things in the field weren't line items, but he knew she knew that, and he knew her way of knowing it was to turn it into data, because data was how Mia survived, and it always had been. "I'll go alone," he said. "No. You'll need someone to carry while you cover." They argued about it in whispers on the roof while the sun came up orange through the haze, and the standing figures in the wheat didn't move and didn't move and didn't move. In the end, Mia won because Mia always won arguments that involved logistics. Joy would stay locked in the basement with the Ruger and a walkie-talkie and strict instructions not to open the door for anyone whose voice she didn't recognize. And Dylan took the Mossberg and a canvas duffel and the 8-inch Wusthof chef's knife that had been with him since culinary school. He'd broken down 10,000 chickens with that knife, filleted more fish than he could count. It was an extension of his hand. An old friend. He slid it into the leather sheath on his belt and felt something settle in him. Not calm, exactly. Just readiness. They went out through the back gate and along the irrigation ditch. The morning was cool and the grass was wet and the world smelled like it always did in June.